First, thank you to Sharik and Nancy for organizing this event and for the opportunity to participate. It is truly an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you. Quick introduction, because unlike yesterday's discussants, I am not a professor. I have an administrative role here at this school with the school's international programs. Today is also my 12th day as a doctoral student in the program, and so I'm mindful of an analogy that our professors gave us when we began last week, that it's helpful to think of this as entering a conversation at a particular point in time. And I know many of you have been engaged in this conversation for years because I inherited Bill Plater's files that chronicle some of the adventures that Barbara mentioned yesterday. And it's been a real treat to meet Dr. Chima, for example, who's also mentioned in those files. So I really appreciated the variety of perspectives in this session that dealt with the global responses to problems as well as local responses, and as well as some of the problems with the literature and scholarship on Muslim philanthropy. So I heard a major theme of maintaining the dignity of the person. This was eloquently expressed by aligning ideas of green and sustainability with the idea of a sustainable human who should be allowed to be/not be, not through inaction, but through a lifestyle that allows for sustainable behavior out of a clear rejection of Western models of development and consumerism. In her paper, Uzma calls for balance between body and mind, material and spiritual, and for a unified understanding of philanthropy in Eastern and Western perspectives. This is a rich narrative, and I hope everyone has a chance to read it in its entirety. It's also a call to stewardship that recognizes the central place of education. And so I'm going to quote a part that you didn't get to, but this is from the paper. Uzma warns us that those who deprive women and girls of an education are harboring the making of an unsustainable human, an unsustainable society, where philanthropic stewardship is obsolete. As an undergraduate student in anthropology, I learned that we all experience the tension between the ideal and the norm, given the contingencies of our local experiences. This is so well illustrated by the interviews with the Hyderabad Zakat Charitable Trust. By the way, Hyderabad is a sister city to Indianapolis. The moral obligation to end the suffering of poverty is deemed by these practitioners to be worth the risk that their zakat may not be legitimate in the eyes of God. But the trade-off is that their philanthropy results in human beings who are whole and able to practice their faith with hope. Danielle introduces us to donors who push zakat, quote, beyond the traditional redistribution of wealth in hopes of changing the structural determinants of poverty itself. It's worth repeating the words of one donor. Everything we were doing, it was all first aid, just stopgap measures. We gave zakat, and still poor people were poor. We had to think about the long term. Education is the key. This is moral action because the poverty that results from the practice of dowry endangers the ability of the people to be productive members of their society, including members of the faith community. As one donor said, I know this could make our zakat impure, but we have to do it. The stakes are too high. We also heard that the recipient of zakat is as important as the donor because both are needed because the exchange is sacred. This inspired in me a clear case of holy envy that Scott mentioned yesterday. One of our faculty members, Lane Benjamin, looks at the issues surrounding the politics of helping and what it means to be a recipient. And I couldn't help thinking, what could that ethos mean for a world in which inequality continues to grow? So these presentations in this session seem like a good start to address Jazim's call for more culturally nuanced research, which explores philanthropy in different cultures and faiths. The critique of Western scholarship on Muslim philanthropy reminded me of what a close colleague in China told me about US researchers on Chinese philanthropy. With some notable and important exceptions, Chinese academics find American research on China to be superficial. So how do we overcome this challenge of superficiality? One of IUPUI's international learning outcomes calls for undergraduates to be humble in the face of difference, tolerant of ambiguity and unfamiliarity, and willing to be in the position of a learner when encountering others. This strikes me as good lifelong advice for all of us as we strive to be aware of our biases. On a practical level, how do we move the conversation forward together? Dr. Chima has outlined a potential research agenda. For those of us new to the field, who should we seek out to learn more? In addition to everyone we've heard from yesterday and today, what scholars are publishing good work? What foundations and organizations are examples of ideal Muslim philanthropy in practice? And could case studies also be created that could inform practitioners and academics alike? With those questions on the table, I'll stop here. Thank you.
We're going to ask all of you to join in, and you can address your questions to a specific panelist. So if you have a question for one of the scholars or a general question that all can address. So with that, I'll open up the floor, and I don't know if we need to pass the microphone.
Good morning, and thank you very much for such a thought-provoking group of papers. If this is day 12, I am so excited to meet you on day 365. That was really lovely. Thank you. And just a comment for Jazim. I think since you brought up Robert McChesney's work, I think you'd be very excited to see his book, which is enormous, which covers 400 years of the Waqf of Balkh. And is really, I think, the kind of study that you're asking to see. So I think you'd be really excited to see that. And I'm really left with a question that I think tries to ask both Tarek and Danielle to come into a conversation, perhaps inspired as well by Uzma. And that is, I mean, Tarek, you gave us a huge vision and a huge question. And Danielle, you gave us one example of a really creative, edgy, dynamic response to a specific space and problem, which, I mean, I at least found resonated in many, many ways with things that I care deeply about, but I think that things that are really on many, many agendas. And I think that this is the beginning of a conversation. How do we find all of these really creative, edgy, open-minded projects that say, okay, zakat, huge idea, major long-standing tradition, reinterpreted, reinvented, I mean, in a very daring way, to maximize the potential of the idea and of the funds to do something that actually has multiplied the value of each dollar or unit of currency given in zakat. How are you going to find all of those and bring them into the space that you're trying to activate?
I think there's a real difference in focus and an understanding of the potential of zakat in each of our presentations. And I would wager that the best thing to do is to not try to resolve that too quickly. zakat, at least in India, and Indian Muslims, as I said, are this very significant demographic group and will only be increasingly so, suffering rates of poverty that are very different than the Middle East. What poverty looks like in South Asia is different. It is a creative site. There's little zakat projects where women run, HIV positive women are given zakat to start little, roadside food stalls and things like that. So India has a tremendous amount of energy and creativity for people to tackle problems. How successful and enduring that is an open question, but that energy is really creative and dynamic in the nonprofit and the NGO sector. To think about institutionalizing zakat, I can also say, as somebody who studies South and Southeast Asia, there's a certain resistance, perhaps, to doing that. Because, for instance, in Pakistan, which has attempted government collection of zakat, scholars have found that it's the poorest who are giving to the even poorer. So the rates of compliance for paying government zakat, or government-administered collected zakat, are very low. And when it is paid by people, it's paid by people who are generally in a pretty low socioeconomic bracket. So I think we, as part of the paying attention to the context that you're asking for, we have to look at what's happening with the nation, what's happening with the state, its ability to provide services. Of course, in Hyderabad, in the wake of communal riots, this steps in as a place where the state couldn't reach, right? Can't, or doesn't want to. And I mean, many Muslims feel forsaken by the Indian government, right? There's a question of how that relationship's going to be resolved. I would also want to say, to think about how states contribute to humanitarian causes. Do we want it to be privately given zakat, which comes into that? You have, again, Pakistan, Muslim majority country, very low payment of income tax, right? So the state is operating with very limited fiscal resources to contribute to even its own humanitarian disasters, earthquakes, of course, being a prominent one. So I think there are a lot of questions, and I would say, as we push to think about global humanitarian projects that are funded by zakat, certainly Islamic relief is a major one. To also, we want to keep that global and local creativity in tension, because they're meeting different needs and they're able also to get traction on certain crucial forms of suffering in different ways. That's perhaps my opinion.
Well, I think the spectrum of the eligibility for people who can receive zakat is quite comprehensive. It's not limited. The issue is with the management of zakat, how it is collected and dispersed. And I think that this is more of a supply chain issue on one side, and also how to find more innovative ways, how to take that paradigm shift from the conventional collection and disbursement versus finding a new ways. I mean, there's a lot of debate going on now on even the crowdfunding. I mean, how we can tap, for example, zakat, where people are, you can leveraging technology, creating a big pools which are bypassing the traditional management system, where people can be, through technology, are also more aware of how their zakat is being dispersed and being received by the people. So the issue is that the zakat, through the traditional way, has perpetuated the dependence and so the poverty. But what it needs is to basically invest in zakat or disperse it in a way that empowers those people to leverage that support, and over a period of time, they actually are graduated and do not need zakat. So I think, again, there's an enormous space to innovate and to research the new ways which are not contradictory to the, primarily the eligibility of the zakat. So it's more about how it is collected and distributed, and we need to explore more alternatives for that.
Regarding the zakah, actually, this issue has been raised during the World Humanitarian Summit. And this is a very strong issue. It has been raised by international organizations like UN agencies and others. I had the chance to talk with one of the famous Islamic economic scholar, Dr. Ali Al-Qaradaghi. He's a professor. He's very well known. He's been a reference to Islamic finance, and he make a fatwa during the Addis Ababa summit, and he rejected that completely. It's not allowed to take the zakat money and distribute it or put it in the hand of international organizations. I think the matter needs a kind of thorough discussion among the Muslims. I mean, like Tariq Chimas and others, and they need to sit and talk with these scholars, because we need to convince them that zakat, giving the zakat, should be taken and given to the poor people, but they need to make sure that it will be in the safe hand. This is their major obstacles. So it is a very dangerous, actually, subject nowadays has been put and even not been raised by the OIC through the OIC organizations. So this issue very, very critical and it need to be tackled very carefully. Otherwise, it will provoke a very, what you call it, a rejection by the classical Islamic scholars.
I'd like to add something. I'm an American and Canadian Muslim. I was raised here, and I think that I feel like sometimes I'm still an other voice within my own Muslim fabric. There are millions of us that when we look at zakat, it needs to be given to the poor. It needs to be given to the needy based on what is written in the Quran. And building masjids today, I feel zakat is being used in some cases, and fatwas are given by some imams that from Saudi or other Muslim countries telling American Muslims how zakat is supposed to be given, for example, for mosque building. Recently in Maryland, they just built a $110 million mosque in Maryland. That's absurd. When most mosques, I actually design and build mosques. I'm working on one in Cleveland right now. I have done 7 of them, designs, of which 2, I didn't get the interview, you do RFPs. And the other one we're working on, and the board is primarily consists of men in our communities who come from different countries with their different approaches to Islam and zakat and giving. That is the problem. We need to change that. We cannot allow how philanthropy is also being done in a approach that is culturally influenced. It's something just to think about. And because I have learned, when I have gone to people, because my ethnicity is Pakistani, Indian, I have gone and visited to some of these countries when I was still in college, and the way they treat women is observed by landlords who run these farmlands, and how they treat peasants to keep them uneducated. 2, where I saw knowledge was actually a blind man in one of my travels, and that blind man had 2 girls, and he told them, do not go around these graves, do not worship these humans. Your creator is up there, it's all around you, it is not inside that grave. I mean, that was an enlightening thing for a blind man to know, and the rest of the population in these rural villages did not, and they control things. So it's basically, as you know, it's a feudal system. And that feudal system, which is something India does not have. So there is more a democratic rule, but I think zakat has to be reviewed in a way as Muslims, we are the trustees. So if we are the trustees, it's mandatory, as is everything else. And one other thing I wanted to add about fidya that Brother Jassim, you mentioned, is people who are sick and ill, we neglect. In Islam, fidya is given if a person does not have to fast, you give fidya. We need to discuss that because in the Muslim world, not American Muslims primarily who were born and raised here, the Muslims neglect, treat terribly those who are ill or sick. And that is against the principles of what Ramadan is about for Muslims. And there's one foundation I found it very inspirational, and it's the IUPUI Foundation. This man should have been a Nobel laureate, and he was not. Because the concept of philanthropy in the Western milieu didn't fit into what IUPUI was doing in Pakistan. And I see that this man took dead people and buried them. People off the streets and peasants, things nobody wanted to do. and he helped the women, give education, give food to these people who are refugees coming from Afghanistan when none of the other countries were taking them. So there's this great thing that this one country is doing, but I still, anyways, I'm diverging from the topic, but I think zakat does need to be looked at and re-looked at and cannot be enculturated from how other cultures are doing it, but back to the source for the Muslim is the Quran.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And yes, Dr. Ibrahim.
I've got 4 quick ones. This panel was just amazing, and I really think we express our gratitude to all 4 of you. We would never eat lunch and dinner if we fully discussed the issues that you have raised. Usma, I thought as you were speaking about this incredibly important vision that you believe Islam offers to us, that we so rarely see examples of where it was achieved or realized in history, and that you might want to look at and think about incorporating the Andalusian moment in your historical progression, because it was, as many scholars have noted, a time in which Europe practiced inclusion to an extent that was never achieved afterwards or until today. And I think it's just a very powerful lived moment to think about including. Tarek, you and I have discussed so many times the problematic that you ended your talk with, which is that when the emphasis is on the gift, it's very hard to shift people's attention to the impact of that gift. And this is an issue that we will deal with. And I felt that Danielle's presentation of this grassroots discussion that they've had about what maybe we could think of as a social contract, but since that might lead them to feel that gifts are impure in a zakat context, maybe it's really about paying forward. That someone who benefits from zakat makes an undertaking to make sure that in their future they are not carrying forward un-Islamic or poverty-inducing practices. We have wonderful examples of Rawad in Jordan, where scholarships are linked to young people giving service and beginning to practice that aspect of their faith. Or in Egypt, where money is saved for extremely impoverished girls if they don't marry until the age of 18. So suddenly they have a value to their families that enforces a delay in childhood marriages. Just something to think about. Is it really impure to ask beneficiaries to pay it forward? And that's something that we could think about engaging Islamic scholars in as well. Finally, for my colleague Jassim, you and I agree that there are problems with the charitable crescent and what it has reinforced in Western discourse. But let's admit in this room that the mixing up of politics and charity, which is happening in this country, it's not unique to Islam, is a huge problem we really cannot push under the rug.
Is that on? I just wanted to respond, and maybe I can clarify this. I think the donors of the Zakat Trust, the Hyderabad Zakat and Charitable Trust, they recognize the risk as the fiqh discourse might have it in terms of how they're giving their zakat, but they're morally convinced that what they're doing is right and it's better, and it's still in line with this, divine vision of what they understand Muslim gender relations and social relations should look like. So I want to make that clear, that even as they're recognizing that, they're sort of encompassing it with a broader, I don't want to say broader, but perhaps a broader understanding of what an Islamic vision of Muslim community is about and Muslim family life is about. So that those tensions of navigating the fiqh are kind of subsumed within this broader moral claim. And I think that tells us something about what lived Islam is like for people. We can have these really clear determinations. Oh, this is zakat, this is sadaqah, this is this. In practice, some of those boundaries get a little fuzzy for people. So we want to pay attention to what that looks like as a lived reality, as a in terms of thinking about how people embody a theological understanding of caring for others, taking responsibility for vulnerability in your contingent life.
Well, let's take this opportunity to thank